Hello, I'm Dr. Garrett Hallweg, and this talk is titled The Justice in Jesus. This talk is on social justice because what you believe matters. What you believe about how we should treat others makes a difference for your brain and, more importantly, on society. Now, at the last talk for the HPN Brain Symposium, I focused on the brain benefits of social relationship. This time, I would like to discuss social justice in order that we can live in brain-healthy communities. The 3 points I will cover in this talk are: number 1, how should we relate to others? This is replacing the unhelpful narrative of the oppressed and oppressors. Instead, recognizing the God-given gifts and abilities in each of us and seeing injustice, seeing suffering, seeing poverty as an opportunity, an invitation to use those gifts and abilities to love and serve a hurting world. Point number 2 is the way that we are made in the image and likeness of God explains and informs human rights and civil rights. And the third point I will be making is history shows advancement in social sciences, humanities, psychology, criminology, political science, or even medicine, which is my discipline. It does not bring about a utopian society. We should continue to strive so that our laws align with God's objective morality, but humans will never achieve something only God can do, bringing heaven here on earth. Now, my first point deals with how should we relate to people? People who have different skin color, people who come from different geographical locations, with different experiences and range in their gifts and abilities. Jesus had something to say on this matter. When the moral law teachers of the time encounter him, they asked him, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And Jesus said to them, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." Then he went on to give them a second. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God, love people. If you're a Christian, you should get behind this movement because this is what the founder of the Christian movement was all about. If you are not a Christian, I think we can all agree that this is a truth everyone can get behind. To underscore this point, we can look at the opposite. If we said don't love people, well, even atheists should agree don't love people is a bad ideology. I want to make absolutely clear Jesus' statement here: love God, love people. People have different ideas, some good, some bad. People's behavior comes from their ideas. People are not equivalent to their ideas. While people are morally culpable for their behaviors, ideas, on the other hand, are up for discussion. The value of a person is not determined by their ideas. We shouldn't cancel a person because they have a bad idea. What Jesus is saying is love all people, not all their ideas. Jesus affirmed good ideas like love your neighbor. Jesus rejects people's bad ideas like, I think I'll sleep with someone else's spouse. Jesus calls people's wrong moral behavior as sin and tells them it comes from their bad ideas that go against love God, love people. Jesus convicts those with wrong moral behavior by saying, don't do that anymore. And he still loves the person. Jesus does not affirm the bad idea or wrong behavior. This love is a type of love called agape love in the original Greek language. And the closest we experience this love is as parents. And as parents, we tell our child no. The parent corrects and guides their children's wrong behavior because they love their child. Despite people having bad ideas and wrong behavior, Jesus loves people, and Jesus commands us to do the same. How does love God, love people compare with what is being taught in our academic institutions of higher education? How does it compare with what is being taught in our corporations across America? Well, here's what universities and corporations across America and Europe are teaching students and workers. They teach them how to relate to others who have differences in race, gender, and abilities or experiences by this. Listen and see if you agree with this. If I am lacking any equitable piece of power or property, I'm a victim. I'm the oppressed. The reason I'm oppressed is my race, my sexual behavior, or any characteristic I can identify that makes me lacking. All others with power or resources are the oppressors. If they don't admit they're oppressors, they are in denial and are part of the problem. A narrative of oppressors and the oppressed is not improving our division. There is a better way. Love God, love people. We know the people Jesus was talking about were people different from us. Someone asked Jesus, when you say love your neighbor, who is my neighbor, Jesus? And Jesus taught the parable of the Good Samaritan as a lesson. Our neighbor includes others not like us. Because the group he was speaking to, they were very different than the Samaritan. And so there has been a whole lot said about Christians, people who follow Jesus, or supposedly follow Jesus, and social justice. Now, instead of looking at the examples of foible humans, pointing to all the failures of those who call themselves Christians or evangelicals, let's look at the source document, the Bible, instead of the behaviors of people who will never follow the Bible perfectly. The Old Testament is the source Jesus is quoting when he gives the greatest commandment: love God and love people. He went on to say, all God's law, all the truth spoken from God's people depend on these two commandments. So Jesus was referring to God's spokespersons, his ambassadors, people called prophets like Isaiah, Micah, David. Now, what are God's words here? Seek justice, correct oppression, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. For the weak, for the orphaned, the afflicted, and the destitute. Okay, great. But I'm a realist. I'm a practical guy. And resources are limited. How do we divide the pie of resources? Well, first, everyone should have the basic necessities for life: food, shelter, clothing, and treatment of illness. Second, we can increase the pie, known as our resources, by recruiting everyone to see themselves for their gifts and abilities God has given them, encouraging them to engage others with those abilities and talents, to serve the suffering world around them. Let it be an invitation to get involved. Let's take the example of the mentally ill in Honolulu. Mentally ill in Hawaii suffer from inadequate housing, hygiene, and treatment. But it's not for lack of people wanting to get involved, individuals wanting to get involved. Law enforcement and judges need to cooperate in enforcing mandatory involuntary treatment of the mentally ill. Please take the time to write your state legislature and tell them we want involuntary hospitalization with mandatory commitments for the mentally ill and drug addicted. This is a much more worthy expenditure of our tax money than a rail transport system that seems to never be able to be finished. Now, everyone should have the basic necessities for life: food, shelter, clothing, and treatment of illness. What about power and resources beyond the basic necessities? How do you divide the rest of the pie? On what basis should these be distributed? Should we consider race? Imagine for a moment if our medical schools only accepted African American students. Now, people everywhere turned up in clinics with sunburns, asking what the medical professionals could do about sunburns. And the African American physicians, who enjoyed high concentrations of melanin in their skin and were not personally affected by sunburns, well, they went on to use their medical knowledge to develop sunscreen and other preventative measures for sunburn. The African American doctors taking care of sunburns don't have to be affected by sunburns to understand the problem and to use their gifts and abilities to be part of the solution. Love God, love people. The African American doctors should not be seen as oppressors to be overthrown, rather an educated resource of solutions for prevention and healing. Love God, love people. Can you do the second, love people, without the first, love God? Sure, you can, but not well, because the justice in Jesus means sacrificially loving people, sacrificing yourself for the benefit of others. You must draw on an otherworldly source of grace to love people who don't always love you back, or people who oppose you. Grace means giving your time, energy, and resources freely to the weak, the afflicted, the destitute, instead of looking at yourself and trying to evaluate what characteristics about you make you oppressed. Loving God, following the example of the sacrificial love of Jesus, allows you to look at your gifts and abilities, not as a victim, but as someone to get involved and help, as ways to bless others. What if the founder of HBN, an immigrant from Malaysia, said, "The color of my skin has determined I am weak, I am afflicted, I am destitute"? Well, Hawaii Pacific Neuroscience would never have come into existence. The cutting-edge, groundbreaking research that's done there, the excellent patient care, and the brain symposiums would never exist. Science supports one race, the human race. The Bible supports one race, the human race. Jesus himself supports one race, the human race. You are not determined to be weak, afflicted, or destitute by skin color. You are determined by how you love God and love people. Can I do the second, love people, without the first, love God? Sure. But loving God and knowing who God is in Jesus and how God loves us through Jesus means knowing what is within your control and doing something about it, and knowing what is outside of your control, and trusting in God to make it right. Let me illustrate. Can I choose the amount of pigmentation in my skin? No. Can I choose how I treat others with different pigmentation? Yes, absolutely. Loving God informs us from an objective standard of how to love people. Let's look at one example. The Bible supports a sexual ethic good for individuals, good for family, good for community, and good for civilization. So can I choose what I do with my genitals. Yes. But I didn't choose what genitals I was given. Can I choose to commit to marriage, to raising children, to placing a high value on my children's education? Yes, of course you can. Now, what if we studied a group who have the highest percentage of marriage and the lowest percentage of divorce, and this same group placed the highest value on education for their children? So their choice and behavior was for marriage. Their choice and behavior was for education of their children. They have no choice in the shape of their eyes or the color of their skin. It turns out this group is Asian Americans. And there is a lawsuit against Harvard and Yale because Asian American children are turned down for admission with higher scores than their fellow applicants with different ethnicities like Hispanic, African American, or Caucasian. Asian Americans are penalized for the good choices their parents made by staying together in marriage and placing a high value on educating their children. These Asian American students are prevented from admission to Harvard and Yale based on their ethnicity, something they have no control over. U.S. courts, worse, have upheld Harvard and Yale University's right to discriminate against Asian Americans. If everyone has an equal opportunity to apply to universities, shouldn't the best scores determine admission? In this way, we are rewarding any family, regardless of their physical characteristics, for their choice to live in marriage, keeping the family intact, and those families who place a high value on education. And if any child struggles, we should see this as an opportunity to help them. If they cannot solve math problems, the solution is not to change math. The solution is to build relationships with families through teaching math. Broken families of any ethnicity means poor math skills. But not just math, reading, writing, emotional and relational capacities as well will suffer. So we are not defined by our skin color. We are defined by how we love God and love people. This brings me to my second point, human rights and civil rights, which explains, informs us from how we are made in the image and likeness of God. Let me demonstrate. As a psychiatrist, often I explain the difference between a genetic trait and a human behavior. A genetic trait is something we have no choice over, like our skin pigmentation, genitalia, height, composition, or structure. A behavior is something we do have a choice. It's like what we value, or our preference, our perspective, our opinions, and our choices. Now, like our parents' choice to marry, stay together, forgive each other, and place a high value on education and respect for authority, we have already established that biology, the Bible, and Jesus loudly proclaim there is one race, the human race. Now, no matter how hard anyone tries to depict the mistakes of followers of Jesus, no one has ever made the case Christianity itself is racist. The truth of Jesus will always remain. All nations are called to look upon Jesus, receive him as the forgiveness of their sin, their mistreatment of other races, or whatever that sin and behavior, wrong moral behavior might be, and see who God is in Jesus and how he loves us through his grace. So how does the way we are made in the image and likeness of God explain human rights or civil rights? Let's take the example of women's rights. A woman does not choose to be born with two X chromosomes. She is genetically determined with traits giving her the capability to produce life. She didn't choose the reproductive equipment of ovaries and a uterus. She can choose to have sex. She can choose sex to be expressed in the safety and security of a covenant marriage. Likewise, men don't choose to be born with XY chromosome. Men grow up to be stronger than their women counterparts, but they don't choose the composition of their muscles. These are genetic traits that are determined. Now, men can choose to protect the women they are surrounded by. Their physical strength has a purpose to prevent injustice, like other men harming the women they love and protect. Women's rights are humans' rights because women matter to Jesus. Women's bodies matter to the future of civilization. When you ask women the most defining moment in their life, far and away they answer, the greatest moment of their life was giving birth to their baby. The most unique and defining quality of women is childbearing, being capable of making offspring. This is how the entire human race continues. Women have obvious value. They were created with the ability to produce children. Men have obvious value. Men were created with the physical strength to protect. The unborn have obvious value. Babies are worthy of protecting just like their mothers. The God of the Bible is the source of love, grace, and justice. If God determines all are his creatures and therefore all are valuable, each one of us have the free will to choose God's design and accept our purpose or oppose God's design and rebel against our God-given purpose. Human and civil rights begins with the value of all life. Human lives are not appraised a higher or lower value based on race, gender, or mental disability. These are genetic traits we did not choose. We determine value of life by how we love God and love people. Our behavior will reflect our ideas about that. We are born with genitalia we did not choose. We can choose what we do with our genitalia. So think about the whole purpose of government creating and enforcing laws. See, people left unchecked can make decisions that are bad for families, bad for communities, and bad for civilization. Imagine no laws governing parental support. If men slept with every woman they desired and left behind a trail of single mothers with children they could not care for, well, we would see increasing poverty. How we love God and love people informs us if we should reprimand the behavior of the sexually reckless, if we should kill the children in the womb who will be fatherless. The Bible prescribes a sexual ethic and protection of human rights for all people. The closer our laws resemble God's wisdom for individuals, for family, for community, for civilization, the better the opportunity to raise children and grow businesses. This brings me to my third and final point. History shows us advancement in social sciences, humanities, psychology, criminology, political science, or even medicine can improve our quality of life. However, our free will to make poor decisions, to behave morally wrong, ensures these advancements will never bring a perfect utopian society. We should continue to strive so that our laws align with God's objective morality and his purpose for our lives and thriving, growing children, growing businesses. But humans will never achieve something only God can do, bring heaven on earth. We are made in God's likeness with attributes of forgiveness, helping others without anything in return, creating and inventing, and giving rise to life, making children in our own image and likeness of the humankind. Part of these divine attributes is an ability to choose to love or to rebel. Until God removes all rebellion, man will not know a perfect utopia. Law and politics is not the right tool to ultimately overcome man's evil desires, the capacity to choose wrong, or her free will for morally wrong behavior. We should expect every society throughout history will get things wrong, and we should learn to be humble and repent of this sin. We should not abandon people with bad ideas. We should abandon the bad ideas. Individuals and governments should help the poor for the basic needs of food, clothing, and shelter. But how? If we try to love people without loving God, we will ignore things like sexual ethics and the prevention of broken families. Individuals and governments should appraise the value of life rather than a perceived economic burden. The only way individuals and governments truly help the poor includes sexual ethics of preventing broken families, aligning with God's design. This means our legislation mirrors the value God places on life, on marriage, and on the family. In the next segment, we will hear from a graduate student at Northwest University, Madeline Alexander, to explain the limits of science and its limits to inform us about social justice. So science does not say anything about morality. In fact, science doesn't say anything at all. Science is a method of collecting data and testing the reality of the world we live in. Scientists interpret data. So as for social justice, the social scientists have an equal say on the matter as anyone interpreting or who looks at the data for interpretation. Here's Madeline to demonstrate this fact.